Creo que vamos a hablar un poco de nuestra lucha, lo que hacemos y también gracias a todo por hacer lo posible.
So thank you all for making the space for us to share a little bit about our work and our struggle with all of you.
Me imagino que han escuchado algo de esto, nunca.
I imagine some of you have already heard about our work, never heard.
Un poquito.
Ya saben poquito.
A little bit. And we, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, represent a group of farm workers that began to organize in the early 90s in Immokalee, Florida, which is a small agricultural town near Naples and Fort Myers in southwest Florida. And we began to organize in the early 90s, but it really wasn't until about 1995 that we came on the stage organizing for farm worker rights. And we began to organize to raise wages and to better working conditions in the fields. We began to organize because there were a lot of bad conditions that we faced. Everything from very low wages, wage theft, violence on the job, and for a lot of the women who worked in the fields, sexual harassment and abuse.
Y la violencia también. Un patrón podía golpear a los trabajadores, le hacía como se le quedaba la gana.
There was also a lot of violence whereby supervisors and crew leaders could hit members or hit farm workers with impunity. And our community, which is made up primarily of folks from Mexico and Central America, including Guatemala and Haiti, began to organize together. So they began to organize to defend their rights and get together and change those conditions. Because how is it possible that for all of the work that they did, they weren't getting a fair wage and they weren't being treated with dignity and respect in the agricultural industry? And so the way they began to organize was to have work stoppages and strikes, hunger strikes, protests, marches, all to try to get a dialogue with the growers, the employers and the owners of these farms, who we as workers thought were responsible for the conditions and the low wages. But little by little, as we began to organize and try to get a dialogue with growers, we realized that it wasn't really the growers that we had to go to. There was a force on top of the growers that had the power to change those conditions. These were the corporations that bought tomatoes in huge quantities, and because of that market power, set the low price that then translated to low wages for us as workers.
Por eso que en esa situación, pues se lanza la campaña con los grandes compradores.
And it was with this realization that we launched what we call the Campaign for Fair Food, targeting these big buyers of tomatoes. And basically what we decided to ask of these corporations were three demands. First, higher wages through a penny more per pound contribution by these corporations that would be able to raise wages that we as farm workers had. Second, the respect of a code of conduct that we as workers designed that had zero tolerance for the worst of abuses, like sexual harassment and assault, and modern-day slavery, and would also implement protections that, like shade and water in the fields that we needed and we saw were necessary. And third, most fundamentally, that the workers' voice would be respected and would be heard in the implementation of all of these changes.
Y esos puntos fue la que se le pidió a Taco Bell como una corporación que compraba una cantidad grande de tomates.
And those were the three key demands that we made of the first company, of Taco Bell, which bought a huge quantity of tomatoes from Florida. And Taco Bell wasn't an easy or a simple target to begin with, but it was a long struggle that lasted from 2001, which was when we launched the national boycott of Taco Bell, to 2005, which is when we had a major victory and they agreed to sign on to our demands. And that victory was won thanks to the close collaboration that we as farm workers had with all different sorts of consumers that supported our struggle. And so we had that seminal victory in 2005, and from then on went to launch more campaigns with more corporations throughout the years that progressed, until we got to the year 2010, when we had been able to bring on board a critical mass of 9 corporations. And it was then that the 3 key demands that we had made, that I just mentioned, became what is now known as the Fair Food Program. And the reason the Fair Food Program was able to be born was because, as a result of the participation of those 9 corporations that had come on board, we were able to bring on 90% of Florida's tomato growers, who saw it as necessary to subscribe to this code of conduct and participate in what we asked for, because it was only then that they would be able to sell to those corporations. Today, we have 14 corporations that are participating in the Fair Food Program, 14 corporations that are leaving that penny more per pound that is then distributed to workers, and 14 corporations that are respecting our rights in the fields. And so we have this Fair Food Program that spans the Florida tomato industry. But we know that there's a lot more workers in a lot more industries that are facing similar issues, low wages and bad working conditions. And so our goal now is to expand this program. There are workers in different industries that are also taking this program and the model it embodies of what we call worker-driven social responsibility, and implementing those principles in their own industries. And so that's one way that the Fair Food Program is expanding with other industries, is through the model. But also, we as the Fair Food Program have expanded into other states. In the past 2 seasons, we've been able to do worker-to-worker education sessions and expand the program's rights to Georgia, North and South Carolina, Maryland, Virginia, and New Jersey. And I would add too that this past season we expanded into strawberries and bell peppers. And there are a lot of workers that are experiencing these rights thanks to that expansion of the Fair Food Program, and that's where we see our work going. But in order for our work to go in that direction, in order for us to be able to expand, we know and understand the urgency of the participation of more and more corporations into our program. The Fair Food Program, to explain a little bit more what that means, is a whole bunch of rights that workers have, and that's why it's important for it to expand. First, that workers are being paid a penny more per pound and they're having higher wages. Second, they know of their rights, and that's something that's really important for workers to understand, that they have rights in the workplace and that their lives and their work matter just as much as people who are born here. Another thing that we have under the Fair Food Program is the guarantee of minimum wage. And whereas before, workers were just paid by the piece and there was no guarantee that they'd be paid at the very least for all of the hours that they were worked, now through the Fair Food Program, there are measures in place for hours to be counted. So every worker has a time card that they punch in and punch out of work, so that if they pick throughout the day but don't pick enough to be able to make minimum wage, at the very least the minimum wage guaranteed in that state, which in Florida is $805, is paid to them and guaranteed.
Y ahora ninguna mujer tiene que dejar su dignidad en el trabajo, no por darle a sus hijos.
And now no woman has to leave her dignity behind in the fields just to be able to feed her children.
Porque ahorita existen protecciones bajo el programa.
Because they are protected under the Fair Food Program.
Cualquier persona que cometa algún tipo de eso, hay consecuencias. Y antes no. Era despedida o nadie te escuchaba.
There are consequences for perpetrators and people responsible for those kinds of abuses. Whereas before, if you spoke out, you might have been dismissed from your job and not be able to be rehired. Now there are consequences for those responsible. So those are some of the main rights that we have under the Fair Food Program, but that's not to mention all of the other basic protections that we have, like clean water, for example, Before, there was no provision of clean water to workers for drinking or for washing their hands. Now there is. Shade in the fields, which is really important when you work in 90, 100-degree heat in the Florida sun. Now that's guaranteed to workers. Bathrooms, which is a very basic thing that every workplace should have, didn't used to be provided, or they would be very dirty and unusable, and folks would have to go into the fields nearby in order to do their business. Now, under the Fair Food Program, growers have to have bathrooms nearby for workers to use in proper conditions. There's also a 24-hour hotline that I would add is answered in English, Spanish, and Creole, which are the languages spoken by the majority of workers. And that 24-hour hotline, just like all of the other rights under the Fair Food Program, are monitored and investigated and enforced by a third-party monitoring body, which is called the Fair Food Standards Council, which has access to the company's books in order to be able to monitor and track the Fair Food Program premium that is paid off to workers, and that also conduct audits and investigations to ensure that workers' rights are being protected. And though our program is expanding, thanks to the participation of all of these corporations and thanks to consumer support to other states and to other crops like strawberries and bell peppers, in order for it to really expand, and in order for those expansions to be sustainable, we need the participation of more corporations into our program and more market power. And that's why right now we're calling on Wendy's to participate in the Fair Food Program. And that's why we've launched a national boycott of that corporation, which has thus far refused to do the right thing and respect the rights of workers. We're calling on them to join the program and respect farm worker human rights. And so that's why we're here today, speaking to all of you as part of the Northeast leg of the Behind the Braids series of tours that we're going on throughout the fall, visiting many states and over 20 cities across the country, spreading the word about our work, about the boycott, and fundamentally raising consciousness around within consumers about the conditions that we as farm workers face in the fields, and exposing the truth behind all of the lies that corporations like Wendy's put out. Because we as workers work and pick the fruits from which they profit, while they go on very happily continuing to profit from our poverty and our exploitation. And we think it's important to raise that consciousness within consumers that don't often stop to think about where their food comes from. We understand that there's a unity between farm workers and consumers to expose those lies that corporations like Wendy's put out and work together to create a new world in which farm workers' rights are respected. So because we understand that it's not just about raising consciousness, but it's also about taking action in the campaign, we invite all of you to join us tomorrow for a protest that we're having at 4 p.m. at the Wendy's on Charles Street here in Providence. And we're having both presentations and actions in all of the cities that we're stopping at, because that's what we're doing. And apart from joining us tomorrow for the protest, we also invite any and all of you to come down to Immokalee and learn about our struggle firsthand. Whenever you're around or you want to come down, we welcome groups from high schools, from universities, from churches, from synagogues, all sorts of people that want to come down and learn about our work. You can come and have a presentation and take a walking tour of our town to learn more about the way our community lives and the way our community works. It is in those two ways and more that we invite you to be part of the history that we're writing as farm workers.